So real-life Alan Partridge Richard Madeley embarrassed himself on Good Morning Britain when debating Chris Packham on whether climate protesters should break the law in order to force the government to take action. Take a look.
I continue to protest peacefully. I will use my imagination, my creativity to come up with peaceful, democratic means to protest. But what the documentary says, that if we are not listened to, there will be those who will have to have their voice heard, and they'll make a louder noise.
But what gives you the right to make that call? For example, there will be those who will draw the parallel between what you're saying and what one of the political elements of the wing of the IRA or of ISIS would say to justify violence in support of the cause. They believed in it passionately with all of their heart and soul and were prepared to risk an army bullet for the sake of the cause. It was their choice to break the law and they had to take the consequences. What gives you the right to say that you have the overview that gives the authority to say, you can do this, you have my support?
Yes, Richard, climate protesters are just like the IRA. Are you completely stupid? Which is probably a question that you shouldn't ask because we already know the answer. You do realise the IRA kill people. Climate groups such as Just Stop Oil are doing no such thing. So following on from a Channel 4 documentary with Packham, the question is, should climate groups break the law? Now, it's clear when people ask this question, they mean, should they break the current draconian laws that have been changed by the government? What the Tories have done over the last couple of years is to try to effectively outlaw protesting, which is a fundamental human right in a so-called democratic society. This should worry everyone because the right to protest isn't restricted to a certain movement, although climate change is the biggest issue humanity faces. And no one is suggesting that protesters start killing people or enacting violence. Plus, this isn't a political issue when you think about it because it affects all of us and the entire planet. So the point Richard makes and the way he frames it is that this is a political issue which is only for the interests of those protesters, which is completely wrong. As I said, it affects everyone. Now, Packham gave a really good response to Madeley's nonsensical rant.
I merely ask the question, is this the right time for us to break the law? Now, as you've already pointed out, climate protesters are already breaking the law. We've changed the law so rapidly in this country to impact upon protest. You can't even stand in the street with a T-shirt on without being dragged away. Now, is that the country that you want to live in? Is that the degrees of freedom that we want taken away from us? Well, at the core of our democracy is our right, our human right to protest. And that human right is being eroded at a critical time in our species' history. If we do not exercise that right to use our voices to change policies to protect us and our future, that of our children and everything living on this planet, then I feel that we're not doing our duty. Our duty at this point is for all of us to ask the question, where do we see the law and where do we see the ethics of that law? And if those laws are no longer just because they're not protecting us, that's the fundamental reason for law, of course. We subjugate ourselves, we give up some of our freedoms for laws, and in return, a stable state, a lack of anarchy, a stable state should provide us with the basic resources, health, food, education, and so forth. But if those stable resources are taken away by climate breakdown, then we have to question whether those laws are fit for purpose.
So Packham was bang on the money. We are in an incredibly desperate situation and we're headed for a dystopian society. In the next 100 years, food will become even more scarce than ever before. We will see entire countries around the world facing food shortages where wars will literally be fought based on basic necessities. I mean, we're already seeing this in Sudan. Currently, they are having a civil war where it's described as the first modern climate change-induced conflict, where the effects of climate change are increasing due to political tensions. We'll fight over water due to global droughts. We'll start to see cities underwater, millions of climate refugees, and we won't be able to handle it. This will then exacerbate the problems with resource distribution even further. Then what's going to happen? Well, in my view, I personally think it's very possible that we turn to climate fascism, where we will have an even more militarized police to clamp down on those who will fight back inevitably against what will most likely be the hoarding of resources reserved for the elites. Right now, not enough people care about climate change, especially those in power. The media, pundits, and people like Madeley still think this is a partisan issue, that it's just a political view. No one is urgently taking the scientists seriously enough, and part of the reason, as all things, the poorest and most desperate people are the first to feel the effects. The global south has been impacted far worse from climate change than those of us in the global north. And because of that, our attitude is, well, out of sight, out of mind. It's only when the richest and the privileged are affected, then we take action. The problem is, it will be too late. By that time, the only option left is for the financial and political elite to save themselves, while the rest of us will suffer, and many of us, millions, will die. This will be a class issue as it is today. It's the upper classes that refuse to do anything about climate change, and when the worst effects hit, you bet your ass they will be the ones protected. Because energy companies care about profit over the people, and radical change that is essential to fighting the climate catastrophe is incredibly difficult. It will be the fault of global corporations, the politicians that do their bidding, but when it comes down to it, they'll make sure they'll save themselves. So if you ask me the question whether climate protesters should break the law in order to desperately get the attention of those who can make change, then I think they are right to do so.